Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the third Dean's Lecture for 2022 here at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. Privileged to be doing this at the beginning of NAIDOC week, so thank you very much for making it along today. It's fantastic. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional custodians of the land. I pay respects to elders both past and present of the Kulin Nation and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present. Okay, we're delighted to have Professor Tracey Bunda here with us tonight. Professor Bunda has travelled from Queensland, and I was just saying to Tracey that Queensland has the best education system in Australia, but both Tracey and myself and Melita have been working in it. She gets to deliver her lecture to us tonight, as I said before, during NAIDOC week, and we certainly appreciate you being here with us tonight, Tracey, and flying down, so thank you very much. I'd like to take the opportunity, we don't normally do this, to acknowledge some guests, and can I start by acknowledging Tracey's daughter, Ngugi Bunda Heath, and I think your partner, Aidan Cottrell, is going to be... Oh, he's here already, there you go, I didn't notice. Welcome along, Aidan, and welcome, Ngugi. I'd also like to acknowledge Associate Professor Melita Hogarth, who's with us tonight, and she'll be providing the thanks at the end, so thank you. Melita's the Assistant Dean Indigenous at MGSE and does an enormous amount of work, and we're really lucky to have her. Inala Cooper, the Director of Barak at the Melbourne Institute for Indigenous Development at the University of Melbourne, and acknowledging great people that work with us, I'd like to also acknowledge our Communications Coordinator, who's got his head down, not wanting to look up. Zane Kingy, welcome along, Zane. You do a great job. And a welcome to everyone else. We really feel privileged by your attendance here tonight. As I mentioned earlier, we're hosting this particular Dean's Lecture in celebration of NAIDOC Week, which began today. NAIDOC Week is an important time to celebrate and recognise the history, culture and achievements of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It's an opportunity for all Australians to learn about First Nations cultures and histories and participate in the celebrations of the oldest continuing living cultures on Earth. So it's a real privilege for MGSE to have Professor Bunda, a proud Ngugi Wakka Wakka woman, to deliver this lecture. Professor Bunda is the Academic Director of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies Unit at the University of Queensland. She has held senior leadership positions in each of the universities in which she's worked. She has an outstanding track record of teaching and research, specialising in the areas of Indigenous education and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander studies. Her research interests are inclusive of Indigenous research methodologies, Indigenous women and Indigenous storying. Professor Bunda has been in the higher education sector since 1986 and has held a number of senior positions, including Convener of the Wimala Centre at the Australian Catholic University, Director of the Wulutaka Centre at the University of Newcastle, Director of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Higher Education at the Ngunnawal Centre at the University of Canberra, Director of the Yaggarendi First Nations Centre for Higher Education and Research at Flinders University, and Head of the College for Indigenous Studies, Education and Research at the University of Southern Queensland. Not too many universities to go. Professor Bunda has recently been appointed to the Australasian Strategic Advisory Board for Higher Education and is a life member of the Australian Association for Research in Education. So without any further ado, I would really feel honoured to be able to welcome Tracey to the stage to deliver her Dean's Lecture on the Indigenous Call for Change, the Higher Education Response. So put your hands together for...
Yeah, I've got my welcome stick. Thank you very much. As a Ngugi Wakka Wakka woman, I too wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of country. And I'm going to say this badly, Wurrung, peoples of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge their contributions to the wider society, both at local and global levels. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank those members of the Koori community of Naarm who have had a watchful eye and offered a helping hand to my daughter, Ngaioka, who is the first Aboriginal dance graduate of VCA and is the current Hutchinson Fellow. To our non-Indigenous friends come family in Naarm, I would also like to say thank you for your care of my daughter. Your collective care abated any concerns that I had while she was a student. I'd like to thank the Dean of the Melbourne Graduate School of Education for inviting me to provide this address. I'm going to give you 8.5 out of 10 for your pronunciation. No, 10 out of 10. They were very hard words to say. And I also want to, in thinking about past presenters, I'm honoured to be in such esteemed company. And thank you to the audience for attending on a cold Naarm evening. I want to take a conversational approach to the address this evening, one which allows me to speak into the experiential as much as the theoretical, to contemplate the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander call for change within the wider society and its implication for universities. Look, I'm going to say Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander all the time throughout this. It's a Queensland thing because we have the largest Torres Strait Islander population, but that doesn't mean that you don't have Torres Strait Islander community here in Naarm. I want to do this through, I want to take a conversational approach. Yep. I do this through a treatment of key documents that seek socio-political movement through reconciliation, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and treaty development. I draw on models of engagement within the university that are known to me and consider how the objectives of these documents can be advanced through quality relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I want to commence the address with a question that I would also like to revisit at the conclusion. I was born in 1961, and so at the moment I'm 61 years of age. I am but one of thousands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who form part of the first generation to not have been incarcerated by legislation that sought to control every aspect of our lives. For non-Indigenous members of the audience and those who work at the University of Melbourne, I ask you to ponder this reality for a moment. So we're talking about Marcia. We're talking about Melita. We're talking about, you know, your colleagues. This point of fact means that your Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues are only either the first or the second generation removed from these times. We are not incarcerated as our parents and grandparents and other ancestors were. This is true. I reference the scholarship of Indigenous lawyer Professor Irene Watson's still relevant 2005 article that interrogates colonisation and its impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. To paraphrase the question that Professor Watson asks, are we then, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, free? I will return to this question. I'd like to now turn my attention to the key documents. I would be the first to raise my hand that my past practice has not been as an advocate of reconciliation. and many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples remain sceptical of the reconciliation process. Reconciliation Australia nominates that reconciliation is about strengthening relationships between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and non-Indigenous peoples for the benefit of all Australians. If there is a hesitancy on the part of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, it is because in the everyday practice of the various organisations in which we are located, the labours that are required to strengthen relationships between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and non-Indigenous peoples have been lopsided. If the burden of responsibility to reconcile rests only with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples expending the most labours, then faith in the process is weakened, if not broken. What then needs to be undertaken in order that finely crafted words of a reconciliation action plan are not relegated to the bookshelves to gather dust so that reconciliation can meet its objective? I acknowledge that various universities have developed RAPs, Reconciliation Action Plans. Central Queensland University, James Cook, Swinburne, Federation University, and of course University of Melbourne. And I also note the statement of reconciliation produced by the Melbourne School Graduate Education. My faith in the reconciliation process is strengthening, and I attribute this change in part to the leadership of Professor Bronwyn Fredericks, who was announced on Saturday night, because the national celebration for NAIDOC was here in Melbourne. So she has been named as she won the National Education Award for her services to education. So for those who get to listen to this recording, woohoo! So Professor Bronwyn Fredericks, who she successfully embedded the UQ RAP throughout the structures of the university. And at UQ, the RAP acts as the education strategy which has been required by government for the university to be in receipt of Indigenous student success program funding. The actions of the UQ RAP address mechanisms for governance, the development of calendar events, establishment of engagement plans with community organisations, through relationships with students, schools and faculties, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander alumni. It's raising awareness of the RAP, development of a cultural education package, developing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander values in the built environment, increasing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employment, supplier diversity, increasing student numbers, development of an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research strategy, indigenising curriculum and reporting RAP achievements. How does the RAP operationalise in everyday? And what I want to do is present a bit of a snapshot through my responsibility as lead on indigenisation of curriculum across the university. Little job. To date, this process has realised the establishment of a working party for the Teaching and Learning Committee. Itself is a subcommittee of the Academic Board, which I co-chair with the Director of the Teaching and Learning Institute, a work plan for the Working Party for the year, a university-wide audit of existing courses, a more focused audit of courses and pedagogical approaches in the Faculty of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, have undertaken external benchmarking, and for those of you who do step into this place, can I please recommend to you Charles Sturt University and what they have been able to achieve under the leadership of Associate Professor Jay Phillips as Head of Indigenous Studies, and also Macquarie University. We have held multiple workshops with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander teaching academics to ascertain what are the issues and what are the directions. We've developed a bank of resources, Indigenous studies, for both staff and students, inclusive of a guide to the language of relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. You'll get a little look at that through the address, just to give you a break from my voice. Policy requirement to address indigenisation of the curriculum at programmatic review level, the development of a draft principles and value statement for indigenising curriculum, and the socialisation of that principle and value statement through key committees in the university. Next stage developments are inclusive of an appointment of a senior Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academic and project officer within the Teaching and Learning Institute. This is a strategy so that people in the university don't all run to me at once. Receipt of feedback and incorporation into the principles and values statement to finalise the document for policy status, and membership of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community teachers and academics to the Higher Education Fellowship Program, formation of a community of practice, continued development of resources, including a podcast series in conversation with Indigenous academics, documentation of best practice examples within the university, further policy considerations, and production and launch of an indigenising curriculum document that is online accessible. Told you it wasn't much work. On reflection, this is a large body of work that has required commitment from various champions throughout the university. So, for example, the President of Academic Board, who never starts academic board unless he takes the opportunity to be able to provide a cultural learning moment, the PVC of Teaching and Learning, and the Institute of Teaching and Learning within the university. The governance is appropriate and policy support is available. But the foundations of this work can be stronger. First and foremost is the small number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander teaching and research academics across schools and in leadership levels. And here I'm just talking about teaching and research academics. At UQ, our number totals 14. Small, huh? I don't see this number enhancing anytime soon, as budgetary constraints are impacting all universities post-COVID. But also with that, there's a lower level prioritisation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academic appointments within faculties, coupled with reductive conceptualisations of how an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academic can best operate within the schools and faculties. And perhaps as a result, a worrying trend is developing that compounds the lack of appointments, whereby the few Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academics coming through the pipeline are not taking up teaching and research positions when available, but rather are opting for or negotiating research-only appointments. I see Melita nodding her head and with a face like this. Faculty and school engagement plans with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities is an important strategy then to fill the gap where there are insufficient Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academics present. And then if we couple that with the credentialing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge holders from the community through the Higher Education Academy Fellowship Program, at least this gives formal professional recognition that in the past has been an ad hoc practice. This should not be the only strategy, however, and the pursuit of more academic appointments should remain on the agenda. Bronwyn and I really work hard so that the university has those appointments as a default position. And lo and behold, anybody who doesn't think that way from Bronnie. Okay. Innovative strategies will need to be developed to attract and retain next generation academics, particularly because we're all competing for a very small pool. And budgetary constraints within the university additionally put pressure on the need to have financial resources for indigenising curriculum, yet are necessary to advance the agenda, particularly in the early stages. The consequence, otherwise, is to exhaust the few who may consider other ways of being able to put their valuable skill set outside of the university. The other matter I wish to raise goes to the capabilities of non-Indigenous academics in teaching Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives, studies and knowledges. I have stipulated in the principles and values statement that teaching in this space needs to occur with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to ensure that past practices of the non-Indigenous academic as the only knower is shifted to create space for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who then become visible in spaces where our voices are heard and our knowledges are understood and respected, and that a decolonising ethic of teaching practice is being centred. Let's flip the view on this issue for a moment and consider the teaching of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives, studies and knowledges from the point of view of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. My colleagues, Professor Bronwyn Fredericks, Dr. Caitlin Barney and myself, in partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues from Monash, ANU, Bond University and Anala, who couldn't be here because she has COVID, here at Melbourne University, undertook a NAIDOC-funded project, the National Centre for Studies in Equity in Higher Education, NAIDOC, on the strategies for success, improving the completion rates for Indigenous students. Graduate student interviews in the project have the following to say. On Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander content in the curriculum, student 1 said this: culturally, I'd say that I wish that Indigenous knowledges had been a little bit more present in some of my studies. I guess that it was more a part of the university culture as opposed to just the Indigenous centre or the unit culture, or even on campus. I just wish it had been a bit more present for the full student body, and that it had been a bit more ingrained in some of my classes and things like that. Student 2. I do think they could improve their programs, the people that engage with and the speaking events. They could do better to engage with traditional owners, or they could engage the Indigenous centre and privilege, put focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander content and knowledges. On the experience of racism, student 3 said this: I literally just had too many scenarios through my degree where I'm very glad that I was white passing. And I know, and not somebody who looked more visible, because that would have made me even more uncomfortable to talk about some of the things that they just have no right to talk about. Student 4. It's not necessarily very blatant experiences of racism that I found most impactful or that led to most discussions with my fellow students. It was mostly experiences like being called out in class as to speak to a universal Indigenous experience, or being called out to act as a representative of a cultural ideal or some way of being. Student 5. So I think you still end up with these issues in classrooms from other students that even unintentionally make comments like, colonialism was good for Indigenous people. Ouch. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander graduates further identified the need for cultural capability training. Student 6. I feel like all the staff actually in general need to have, what's it called? Cultural competency training, which is especially for example, Aboriginality. Everyone should do that in their first year as one of the mandatory course requirements. Student 7, and I love this student, bear with me, and I think I really advise that every single tutor and lecturer, but especially the tutors, because they're the ones doing the teaching in your classroom, no matter what course they teach, should really do cultural awareness training, because they just don't, and they really should. And student 8, the one thing that they still need to improve is educating staff. The PVCIE purchased licences from the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies for cultural learning modules. And that moves some way towards providing cultural capability training. There's 10 altogether. Modules 1 and 2 are considered introductory. Now, these modules do not provide all of the answers at school and faculty level and shouldn't be thought of in this way. The relevance of the learning in the modules needs to be extrapolated for further relevancy to disciplinary and other contexts. Some of the faculty RAP committees within the university have supplemented these cultural learning modules with further cultural capacity training from private Aboriginal companies that offer this service. Multiple Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander points of view are always beneficial in addressing the mythology of universality and homogeneity. The Faculty of Medicine RAP committee is contemplating the completion of the 10 modules as conditional for engaging in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research. This is really quite a tense space for us. in the absence of not completing the modules, non-Indigenous researchers in Indigenous research would not be supported by the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership team of the medicine faculty. KJ's going. As the lead for indigenising the curriculum, I'm recommending completion of the first two introductory modules. Now, completion of the modules enables membership to the RAP staff network. So completion of the introductory modules, you will be credentialed as a friend. The completion of 6 modules, you'll be credentialed as a partner. And completion of all the 10 modules, you'll be credentialed as an agent. Champions of the network are also identified, such as the PVC IE and the ADI faculty of HAS. Alida? ADIs, champions. The RAP staff network has an active professional and academic staff membership of approximately 75 at the moment, and it's through this network that further reconciliation agendas can be advanced, such as raising funds for scholarships for students. The university has an established Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Education Scholarship Foundation, which builds this opportunity. Cultural capability training inevitably leads to further questions being asked and issues become raised. So I want to take a moment in this address to share with the audience the video "You Can't Ask That." It's got a different title there. The mob here will laugh when they see it. This video resulted from a student-staff partnership. And I don't know if you have them at University of Melbourne, but when we engage with our students get paid in those partnerships. So it's a really, it's a really good way in being able to produce those projects that you never get to, but then you get to do them with the students, which is really great fun, and then they get paid because of it. So this video resulted from that student-staff partnership and will be featured in the Guide to Language of Relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Peoples, which is a press book. So we'll have a look at that little video now.
Don't Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders get free housing and heaps of money from the government? Where?
Where's my house?
Where's my house then?
What's the time? Tell me the time.
What does an Aboriginal person look like? My answer to this is you can't define an Aboriginal person. We come in all shapes and sizes, our skin colour is different to one another, our eye colour, and so you just can't define one.
An Aboriginal person looks like me. Can look like CJ, we can look like absolutely anything. We come in all different shapes and sizes and colours. We are very diverse people.
I've got cousins that are light skinned. They do have blonde hair and blue eyes.
Me too.
And then I've got cousins that are really dark skinned as well.
There is no typical Aboriginal person, from the blackest black person, skinned person, to the fairest. The range is enormous.
It's not necessarily about skin colour. That's probably the general perception that is something we have to work towards demystifying. We've been colonised, but we still have connection to our country, to our lands. So, there's obviously been interrelations from first contact, that changes, but we're still connected, we're still here.
What was that analogy? I think it was like you can still add milk to the tea and it will still be tea.
You speak well for an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander.
Oh, that's gammon.
I hate this.
Yeah.
I hate when I get told this sometimes.
Absolutely, I think it's something, especially a lot of us who are in tertiary institutions, we definitely get told that a lot.
Yeah, for sure. Whatever your experience is with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and how they talk to you in the past, that's a completely different person, so of course they're going to talk to you differently. We don't all sound the same.
I think that's very racist. I think it's stereotyping, and it's offensive. It's a backhanded compliment. Yeah, well, they're insinuating that our people don't usually speak well.
Many of my brothers and sisters across this nation, English is a second or third language. So, yes, some of us have learned to speak well and write well, and that all comes from opportunities of education, but equally the connection to our languages is really important, cultural connection for us as well.
My mother tongue has basically been eradicated. I never learnt it as a child or even growing up as an adult. I understand it. So when people speak it or when we sing songs in it, I know exactly what they're singing and I can interpret. And then we have a Creole that when I speak, I'll speak to somebody from the islands in this Creole, not in my mother tongue. So those are the sort of things that we're affected by coming off the island and by government policies at the time to stop us from speaking our languages.
Don't Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders get free housing and heaps of money from the government? Where?
Where's my house?
Where's my house then?
I'm still waiting for my free house.
Yeah, I want one. Can I have a free car as well?
I've worked since I was 18, basically looked after myself from like in my early 20s when I've lost both my parents, and worked full-time jobs.
What they're thinking of is how some of Australia's, our government's resources, there's a chunk of it that is invested into Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, perhaps health and housing stuff, because we need it. I mean, after all these years of genocide, assimilation, colonisation, like we are at a disadvantage in our health. We do have a shorter life expectancy, of course. We're going to need more money in terms of like providing hospitals and care in remote communities. That just makes sense.
It's not a handout. It's not even a hand up. It doesn't go close to fixing the issues that we have today across health, across education, incarceration rates. They're still too high. There's still too many issues that aren't resolved. The money's not the answer to the problems, but there are certainly people and communities that need that sort of support.
Pretty sure that all Australians can receive benefits from the government, not just Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders.
Why can't you guys just get over it? Well, we can't get over it because it's still happening across Australia. I still see the effects that it has towards my family, my mother, my aunts, my uncles, especially my little cousins. We can't get over it because, yeah, it's still occurring and affecting them.
Well, I'm not sure what it is we have to get over, but we still have to recognise and understand how this land was first invaded. And when the country can move forward with that and understand what reconciliation actually means, then that'll become important. But Aboriginal people are going to be here forever, and so is culture.
I think people aren't really well educated on the topic of what they're asking us to get over. A lot of them think that it happened over 200 years ago, but it's not true. That's actually when it started. It started over 200 years ago.
Basically an understanding of our cultures, where we've come from, like understanding where we've come from, what's affected our lives, to to the time where we are now, and how government policies or how our lives have been, dismantled. When I'm only speaking on what's affected me, and then there's my forefathers who were also affected by different things. So there's a lot of history there to get over.
What can people ask you? I think people can ask me what my mob is. I love talking about my culture. I love talking about my family, my community. But I think, try to avoid those how much benefits do you get or anything like that sort, because it's just not gonna move the conversation forward, and you're not gonna learn about me and my culture if you don't ask the right questions.
You could ask me, what is your ancestry, or what is your bloodline, or who was your mom?
Yeah, what is your heritage? Do you identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander? Like, inquire politely, don't assume. Definitely not.
Don't say, oh, you look Indian, where are you from?
Yeah.
Don't say that.
I get Greek a lot. Yeah, no, ask, where is your family from? Where were you born, perhaps? It's kind of simple.
And if we're Australian, you can ask, what country were you born? That should be a new question people ask each other. They should all know who were the traditional owners of the land they were born on.
Like, I love talking about my culture. I love talking about home. So telling people about that and just giving them a little bit of information so that they can go home and do some research and stuff like that.
And also, why does our heritage matter? Like, why is that the first thing someone has to ask?
Yeah. I don't ask a non-Indigenous person, where in Europe are you from?
Yeah.
It just doesn't matter to me.
Do your own research, it's your responsibility. It's very taxing having to tell people about your culture, what happened. It's very draining emotionally, so people have to take their own responsibility and educate themselves. It's not my job.
We all have different lived experiences. Mine's different to Mary's. Mine's probably different to my brother and sister. They're a bit darker skinned than me. So we all have our own lived experience. We all need to lean into the conversation. This is what we want to have. This is part of reconciliation, is both sides coming together and having that conversation. Sometimes that's a little challenging for everyone. Just lean into it.
That's it. That's a question.
That's a wrap.
Yeah. It's good fun. It was really good fun doing that with no academic there whatsoever. Okay. I'm a little bit aware of time. I just want to skip a little bit forward and talk about those conversations that we have. Colonisation was not in fact good for Indigenous people and has left a legacy of interracial relationships whereby Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples yearn for a different discussion, particularly from those non-Indigenous people who have failed to interrogate the entrapments of the colonial legacy. The lasting of this legacy means that engagements require truth-telling, which is called for in reconciliation, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and in treaty making, both in Queensland and Victoria. I had the fortune last year to be part of an Indigenous Architects Symposium. I know, go figure. What am I doing there? Hosted by my friend and colleague Carol Gosam of University of Queensland. Jeff Greenaway of this university raised an interesting point in the symposium. He said that no longer can our interracial relationships be transactional, they must be relational. So let's think on this. What does this call for change in relationships mean from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander positionalities? Australia is a nation that has a colonising relationship with First Nations people, and the colonialist nature of this relationship has been informed by notions of race, where it was held that the dominant culture was superior and First Nations were positioned as subservient and inferior. And I lean into Patrick Wolf's seminal work in understanding colonisation as a structure, not an event of the historical past, to acknowledge that colonisation continues in various forms at individual, institutional and ideological levels. In contrast, at the heart of relationships that are held with within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander practices, there is relationality and the principle of reciprocity. Allow me to provide you with the most recent example of the transactional non-Indigenous person in conversation, which I in turn took as an opportunity to be educative whilst also trying to hold to my value system of Aboriginal reciprocity to inform the engagement. Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander audience members will know the tenor of this conversation too well. The Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Studies Unit was recently contacted by a non-Indigenous postdoctoral fellow. And can I add that the academic team, bless their little cotton socks, were hesitant to respond given that these forms of communication land on our doorstep on a regular basis. The researcher was seeking to engage with named Aboriginal communities, and I paraphrase here, to be able to develop grant applications within 6 to 18 months for their research. They did mention they wanted to engage in mutually beneficial ways and with genuine inclusion. I now read my response in full. Actual names have been anonymised. Thank you for your request. It would be good if you undertook some preliminary work for the questions you raise. Speak with X, who as a non-Indigenous scholar and colleague to many Aboriginal peoples would be able to assist you and your intentions to understand how to engage with Aboriginal communities. I recall X facilitating a great Researching with Indigenous Communities podcast online forum last year, and hopefully still has this recording for you to listen to. If Junior Colleague 1 and Senior Colleague 2, as Aboriginal academics and researchers in the faculty have time, you may be able to set up a meeting to discuss your questions. If 1 and 2 are able to make time for you, I would ask you, and I say this respectfully, to think about, and you've raised this in your email, mutual benefit of that conversation. Again, I say this respectfully, as Aboriginal academics and researchers, conversations with non-Indigenous researchers reflect an expectation that answers will be automatically provided. Without an understanding of relationships for asking questions within our communities are constructed differently. Fellow, with this in mind, I would then ask you, what have you done to investigate research relationships with Aboriginal groups you name? Have you investigated the local Aboriginal community organisations for each group? Have you ascertained whether these organisations have research protocols, and what are these? How are you intending to develop a relationship with these groups for projects and grant applications in 6 to 18 months? Would this be realistic, given that you leave me with an impression that you have not engaged with Aboriginal people previously? I do not want to seem harsh, fellow. Your research is interesting. I raise these questions for you to think more deeply about your relationships with Aboriginal people, the senior colleague, the junior colleague, any Aboriginal person in the research space. Start with X. You will benefit from that conversation in the first instance. I would also read the IATSIS Code of Ethics, and I hope this has been of assistance. To their credit, the research fellow took on board my suggestions in their reply to me. I had, however, CC'd the junior and senior Aboriginal colleagues into my email, and with their permission, the junior colleague replied to me, and I read their response. Thanks, Tracey. It's a pleasure to read your constructive response to the fellow. I get the same feeling that you articulate from your email. Seeing how you field requests like this makes me feel better about how I respond to them myself, often without the answers that my colleagues are seeking. It also gives me ideas for how to respond to similar requests in the future. I feel that colleagues in the discipline are often interested in extracting our knowledge first and foremost for assimilation under their own ways of knowing, centering the dominant culture of the discipline above respecting our rights and recognising the validity of our knowledge systems. This seems to be playing out in conversations within the faculty that I'm part of. Lots of talk about the rich body of Indigenous knowledge that can be harvested and has been missed by the discipline. Not so much talk about rights, respect, ethics, relationality. All these things I think about when I think of our knowledge systems, junior colleague. What can we then draw from these engagement? The digital space is as much racialised as the face-to-face. Are these engagements characterised by racism? Well, no, but yes. Not a blatant form of racism, but there is abrasion in the communication, an expectation that the transactional suffices. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and non-Indigenous allies would also recognise the burden of cultural load in these engagements for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We well know how we too become entrapped in cycles of gratuitous concurrence. When I think back to the workshops conducted with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academics, a key issue that was raised pertained to cultural load and the reticence by non-Indigenous staff to step into the space so as not to do the wrong thing. I've written previously on this location held by non-Indigenous peoples as a site of privilege where whiteness seeks to hold virtue. In Eve Tuck and K. Wayne Yang's 2012 article titled Decolonisation is Not a Metaphor, they name this location as a move to innocence in referencing Malwini. I recommend the article to you as Tuck and Yang offer explanation of the many moves to innocence to justify settler colonial guilt. It is a worthwhile intellectual exercise to reconsider the article for reflecting on in Australian context. I'm looking at the Indigenous academics in the room. So can this situation be addressed? Quite simply, the infrastructure needs to be built, and this requires genuine commitment on behalf of the university to respond in cooperation with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. For schools of education, future graduates will be stepping into an Australia that does need to be reconciled, an Australia that will have constitutional change, and one where treaty exists, and in the not too distant future, a world where our sovereignties as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are acknowledged. A very different world to the one in which I stepped into after my teacher education degree, one in which these rights of women, the rights of women were being challenged through legislative process, and where the social contract of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander self-determination was forever becoming. The teaching of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and histories for the compulsory course in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education will therefore require rethinking. Moreover, because we do not have the sufficient numbers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education academics to teach the course. Rethinking this course cannot invite hesitancy in raising the hard questions and conversations. Such work by the schools of education will be a contribution to building greater trust between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and non-Indigenous people, and improve understandings of racism for the benefit of all. I focus on these attitudes, which are measured in the domain of race relations and unity in the Reconciliation Barometer. In 2020, it was found that 60% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people surveyed agreed that Australia is a racist country, compared to 43% of non-Indigenous peoples. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have higher levels of trust towards others in the general community compared to the general community having trust in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And this is in spite of the fact that both groups believe that the shared relationship is important. And I focus on these domains because for me, they are strong indications of the labours ahead. In my conclusion to this address, I return to the original question. Am I, and along with other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, are we free? I would have to say that the path to having true senses of freedom and stronger senses of liberty are complex. Reconciliation, the Uluru Statement from the Heart and Treaty are all paths which I walk with optimistic caution. The implications for the university in being cognizant of the call for change in these documents are multiple, and foremost, the university can do better. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's call for change and being able to achieve this change is situated with its corollary, that is, non-Indigenous action. The claims of the university as a key site of knowledge production are weakened unless it begins to make available genuine and sustainable space for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge systems to inform teaching, research and innovation. In the spirit of celebrating National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Week, and within our own ways of speaking to the university, it will be required to get up, stand up and show up. Thank you for the honour of providing me.